Ercilia is a political scientist and a beekeeper from Argentina. She's worked as an executive director for several grassroots organizations in Latin America, including right here, the Center for Global Justice. She is currently the Latin American political director for Regeneration International, which is working on organic regenerative agriculture, land use, climate change, and immigration. So we're looking forward to see about some of the original things that Ercilia has to say about all of this. And afterwards, I invite you to stay for a discussion. I'm sure you'll have a lot of interesting questions for Ercilia and interesting comments to make that this talk will generate. So without further ado, Ercilia.
All right, thank you. Hi, good morning. Buenos dias. I know many of you guys because, as Gregory mentioned, I was fortunate enough to work here at the Center for Global Justice with Cliff and Bob and Betsy and Sally and Peter and Gregory, and I can go on and continue naming all the magnificent individuals that I had the opportunity to work with. And I was lucky to be working with one very radical organization in San Miguel who looks at all the different aspects of life and politics. And it's, you know, when I look at some of the programs, I still get the newsletters and information on the events that are going to happen. And when I look at them, I just see the way the Center for Global Justice tackles and looks at issues from a multidisciplinary perspective. And the reason why I'm saying all of this is because I believe that having worked at the Center for Global Justice gave me also the incentive to look at things in a multidisciplinary way as well. And I got into the issue and started thinking about climate change a little bit by, a little bit late in my life. I mean, people would start talking in high school or school, people would give you these talks about climate change and the urgency of climate change and the polar bears and the, ice polar caps melting. And it was, it was all important issues to me. It reached my heart. But I looked around me and I saw that there were other issues related to social injustice, to poverty, to neoliberalism and capitalism and all the effects that that has. And I didn't really think that climate change was such a huge issue. I honestly didn't. Until I started connecting the dots and I started realizing more and more that the issue of climate change, just as the many, many issues of climate and social injustice in the world, has to do with difference of power, has to do with people that have a lot and people that don't have that much, has to do with corporate takeover, has to do with basically bottom line capitalism and the neoliberalism that our world has been living for decades and decades now. And going back, I always listen to my friend Gregory Deman chats here, and he always does this great, he goes back to philosophy and history and etymology and all that. And if we look at the etymology of the word human, we're all human beings, that's something that connects us all. The root of the word human has to do with, anybody knows where it comes from, human? Gregory?
No.
Oh, okay. So it's the Latin word for the Latin root for it is humus or humus, right? And if we think about Adam or Adam, the root of that word in Hebrew is Adamus, which is the Hebrew word for soil. If we look at nature, it goes back to natura. Natura rings with natal, nacimiento, natalicio, which is birth. if we think about culture, we think about cultivating, which is not far from agriculture. And you know, all these things, when you start thinking about it, start resonating more and more and more and more. We usually think about cities and civilization as opposed to rural life and agriculture. We start forgetting that we come, you know, in biblical references, we come from this and we go back there, and one day we'll all be buried down there in the soil. And I started thinking about the issues of climate change, but also living here in San Miguel, I started thinking about agriculture as an integral component of who we are as human beings. Not etymologically, obviously, as well, but also thinking about it in terms of what we do as human beings, what we eat, how we eat, where does our food come from. I started thinking about all those issues too. And I started thinking that not so much in Spanish, because in Spanish we say tierra, you know, which is more of an earthly terrestrial word, but in English, what's the other word that we use for soil? You know, when we buy a pot, we usually put dirt. And we relate dirt with something, you know, something that is dirty, that is not clean, that is not neat. You know, how disenfranchised, how we have separated ourselves from the soil. And, you know, the more and more I started thinking about it, I realized that I really didn't know much about the soil. If we walk around in fields, we're usually looking up. You know, we know so much about the stars, about the universe, about the planet. Really, what do we know about the life that is down there under the soil? And why is it that we don't think about it? We just take the soil for granted. You know, it's where we stand on, and just what keeps us going, and somewhere where, you know, one day we'll go back to. But I started realizing I didn't know much about the soil either. I'm talking to friends here who farm organically, that do organic agriculture. They started telling me more and more about the soil. I started talking more with the folks at Bioorganica and Organic Consumers Association as well, and what they were doing in terms of agriculture and soil and food. So I also went on and started reading more about the soil. And I realized that there's little knowledge everywhere else in the world about soil. Of course, there's great soil scientists, you know. There's people that have been measuring and trying to find out what is in the soil for decades and decades and decades now, especially in the US. There's great universities that have dedicated a great amount of money to studying soil. And what they found out is that soils are among the most diverse habitats in all of the universe, and on Earth, of course. Soil themselves are home to more than 1/4 of all living species. You know, they say that you take a handful of soil and there are so many organisms living there, you cannot, of course, count them or see them, but it's probably take, you know, a handful of soil and it's like half of Mexico City in there. And hey, there's lots of people that live in Mexico City, including sometimes myself, sadly. There's a visible life of the soil. You know, if you put your head, if you rest your head and you look at the grass, you see ants, you see beetles, you sometimes see a little worm coming out of the soil. You see earthworms, of course, but there's also that invisible life underneath that layer of soil that is made of fungi, that is made of nematodes, that is made of protozoes, that is made of bacteria. And we really don't think about it. It's dirty down there, it really is. But it's dirty in a good way, and that's what keeps the life of the soil so fertile, and that's what actually keeps us living. You know, that's what keeps us moving. If it wasn't for the whole process of photosynthesis that we studied, you know, when we were little and we were in school, and how the plants to turn all that energy from the sun into sugars and feed them to all this little, you know, life, invisible life that is under the soil, the whole process of creating oxygen and saving carbon would not exist. I'm not a soil scientist. but I got really interested into what was happening there in the soil. And I learned also that soil contains over 10 times more carbon than trees. We usually think about trees, you know, we see a big robust tree, we see all their leaves, and we know that that guy is doing a great job at giving me the oxygen I need, and I'm, you know, in a way, giving them the carbon dioxide that they need in order to grow. So, what is not obvious, and one of the reasons why people, when they talk about agriculture and climate change, which is the main topic of this conversation, and we will get there, don't really look at the soil as a carbon sink. But we know, studies have shown, that soil, again I repeat, contains over 10 times more carbon than trees. In a forest, there's 360 billion tons of carbon. This is a huge figure, I can even imagine it, you know, visualize what that means. But the atmosphere has 200 billion tons of carbon, and the soil has 4,000 billion tons of carbon, right there, they're trapped right there. So, great. We know that the soils are there, we know that the soils are our friends, we know that the soils have an enormous capacity to store carbon, but what are we doing with the soils exactly? You know, are we taking care of our soils? What are we doing with them? Do we think about our soils? Well, we know that 1/3 of all the arable land in the world is degraded. 1/3 of all the arable land in the world is degraded. Due to erosion, because this land is so degraded that it doesn't have the capability to absorb any water anymore. You know, it's not a sponge anymore, it's just, you know, here it rains, and we see that a lot in San Miguel area, which is, you know, it's semi-desert, but it's also the way we treat the soil and the way we do our conventional industrial agriculture implies that there's runoffs of that water, and those runoffs usually go into waterways. And every year, due to erosion, 75 billion tons of covered soil are lost. It's kind of hard to break that down, 75 billion tons, but it's like if each of us brought like a barrel of dirt, because it's not soil anymore, of dirt, and put it in the ocean. That's what we're doing, basically. Think about all of us, we could make a little mountain out here, we could help the guys that are fixing the road a little bit. So we lose soil, but we also are losing many things when we lose our soil quality. We're losing livelihood. Many farmers, more and more farmers around the world are losing their livelihood. We're losing biodiversity. That whole village of creatures, of bacteria, of life, of fungi that is underneath the soil implies biodiversity. By losing our soil quality, we're losing biodiversity. We are definitely putting more carbon out there in the atmosphere. And not just carbon, we are also putting other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere as well. So the type of agriculture and the type of vision that doesn't really look into the soil, is not concerned about the soil, is the way we do agriculture nowadays, which is industrial agriculture. And when we look at that, we look at a type of agriculture that extracts. After all, agriculture is a type of extractivism, just like mining is a type of extractivism as well. But we're talking about a type of agriculture that takes, and never gives in. And if it does give in, it put the inputs as, chemical fertilizers. So basically what a chemical fertilizer does in the long run is make all these plants lazy, provide them with whatever they need, and kill soil biodiversity. We'll talk more about fertilizers and pesticides also in a little bit. All these things are connected. It's like, it's like the talks at the Center for Global Justice. Like, everything is connected. You got to tackle and look at the issue in a multi-layer way. So we have come to call this type of agriculture degenerative agriculture. Degenerative. My accent sometimes is funny, so if you don't understand, you just be honest and tell me. So degenerative agriculture versus regenerative agriculture. We think about regeneration, we think about regenerating the soil, but what we know that industrial agriculture is doing now is degenerating. It's degenerating, degrading our soils. Regenerative agriculture is based on the law of return, which is giving back nutrients to the soil and let the soil rest. Because we know that if we just take, what we're doing is basically we're robbing from the future generations, which haven't been born yet. This is the worst type of stealing that you can do. This is not just stealing, candy from a kid. This is stealing from someone that hasn't even been born and stealing the possibility of all these future generations to have a future, basically because of our greed and basically because we human beings cannot think long term. We know that just like it takes a village for this soil to be healthy, it takes a village of microbes, it takes a village of bacteria, of fungi, of all this life that is under the soil. It also takes a village for us to look at the problem of soil, of degradation of soil, of degradation of life. And we realized, when I say we, I'm talking about many, many movements across the world, which Regeneration International, where I work with, is one of them. We realized that if we look at the issue of agriculture and climate change only as scientists, only from academia, only as consumers, we could not solve this issue. We realized that we needed to put together consumers, we needed to put together producers, we needed to get farmers, scientists, activists, policymakers in part of this equation, and try to create a direction that creates economical viability for producers, that creates a conscious consumer that knows. I'm preaching to the choir here, because most of you guys, you live in San Miguel, and we are very lucky, we're very fortunate. We've got a huge organic market that happens every Saturdays now, the Tosma? Okay. Sunday or Saturday? Saturday and Sunday. Okay, there you go. So we got that. We've got so many organic stores in town. So you know precisely what I'm talking about. But say, how come that if we know that it's healthier to eat that type of food, around the world, globally, there's $486 billion that are allocated annually to subsidize crop food and industrial agriculture. So we realize that in order to start talking to policymakers, start talking to people that could make a change, we first had to make a change. We first had to create a movement, gain energy, gain speed, and start communicating what we found out, and start making these things that we think are so simple. I mean, soil scientists will tell you it's not rocket science. It's very, very simple. Sometimes scientists do have an issue in communicating things in a more understandable way for a general public, but we realized that with practitioners, with farmers, with consumers, with communicators, we can spread the message. And the message is that the soil matters, and that agriculture, that in a regenerative way, also matters, and that we need to change the way we're doing things before it's too late. And now going to the main topic of our talk, which is climate change and agriculture. How many, any of you can tell me, or how many, many, can tell me how much does agriculture, done in the industrial way, contribute to climate change? So, in other words, how much percentage of greenhouse gases are being emitted by agriculture?
30%.
30?
55%.
55%? You okay?
Yeah.
Wow, most people tell you, 13 or 15. 30, 55. Okay, why 30? What is that made of?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the animals
Okay.
that we're eating, in particular cows and things like that.
So methane coming from feedlots and CAFOs confining, okay.
The disappearance of the Amazon for feedlots.
For feedlots. So deforestation,
together, basically.
changing land use, and you said 50.
They've touched on most of mine.
Okay, great, great. And yes, of course, it's 55% actually. So you win. You get a free tamal from Sally, who's got the baby Jesus, so they're having tamales on February 11th instead of for global justice.
You get a free hamburger from Sahores.
Thank you.
You get a free hamburger. What type of meat though?
Vegetarian.
Veal meat, of course. Great. Well, actually, it goes anywhere from 44 to 57%. That's how much agriculture, the current way, contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. And if you break it down, you got 11 to 50% is agricultural production, the way we, well, I don't want to say we, the way that it's being done all over the world. 15 to 18% has to do with changes in land use and deforestation, what you guys were mentioning. I mean, I come from Argentina, and I've seen a change throughout my life in the way we use land. Back in the day, you know, we would have a multiplicity of different crops, and then all of a sudden, you know, since the 90s, what we have is a monoculture. Again, cultivate, you know, diversity of cultures, and then monoculture. How can anything good come from a monocrop? I mean, that's, even the war should tell us something. So changes in land use and deforestation, a lot of the soy that is being cultivated in Argentina, a lot of the corn, it's being used to feed the cattle. That also contributes to the whole cake of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. The process of packaging, transportation, and sailing also contributes to greenhouse gas emission, 15 to 20%. And a big issue that doesn't count as much, but I think that we have to consider that between 2 and 5% is created by waste. In our whole process of food, there's a great deal of waste. That's why sometimes when people tell you we need to have industrial agriculture, we need to have GMOs, we need to have transgenics, because we're not going to be able to feed in 2050 9.5 billion people. How much food are we producing now? We're producing food for that amount and more people. And we're producing more food, not to feed humans, but to feed cows, so to create biodiesel. So, you know, we can talk more about it when Dorothy, when you moderate, are you gonna moderate? Okay. All right. So that's great that you said 50%. That's great that you said 30%. Most people, again, think about it as 10 to 15%. Now, if you guys know that, most people here know that, if I know that, if we know that there's a type of agriculture that is regenerative and that is degenerative, and we know that agriculture is a huge part of the problem, but can also be a huge part of the solution, done in a different way, well, how come nobody's doing anything about it? I mean, people are looking at climate change, and they're looking about, you know, at alternative energy. Great, we also need to look at that. People are looking at climate change, and they're seeing issues of mobility. They're seeing issues of transportation. They're looking at cities, and we have to also tackle that, and how cities can be more efficient. They're coming up with, you know, these great science fiction geoengineering solutions, which, you know, most people think about that as chemotherapy for the planet. That's basically what that's gonna be. You know, we don't know what those geoengineering solutions could do, what the consequences of that could be. We're talking about injecting a bunch of carbon into the core of the planet. We're talking about putting all these mirrors in the atmosphere so that they reflect the sunlight. I mean, these are things that I think one person in the planet could say, and he's currently in the White House. But these are like kind of, you know, these crazy solutions when we know that there's a way to do things differently. And why do you guys think that that's not happening? Why isn't people talking about solutions that are, you know, shovel ready, that are, you know, underneath our feet? that we know how to do it and we can do it now. What's the issue there?
I mean, I grew up in an agricultural state, Kansas. They're in denial. They don't believe it exists. And they're not going to change because they don't think it exists. And then you have a president in the White House that confirms that. You know, they're not going to, I guess change doesn't happen until you have to.
Okay.
Usually.
And that's one of the things. You nailed it. I mean, a lot of, you know, farmers vote for the right. You know, they're very Republican, they're very conservative. Same thing, not just in the States, same thing, you know, in most of South America where I come from.
I think another reason is that all of the publicity is given to the anti-fossil fuel aspect in alternative energy. We never hear about agricultural emphasis to do with any kind of climate change effect. Mm-hmm. So it's just unawareness.
I think one of the most important things is dinero. The vested interests in doing the type of agriculture that exists now, the industrial agriculture, and that, as Ercilia said, it's the only way to feed the planet in 2050 when there will be 9.5 billion people or so forth. And it's the way it's been done. So it's the accepted way of thinking about things, and to think in a different way is kind of crazy, because you're going against the whole logic of making money and the way it's being done now. So I think money, always follow the money trail, because I think that'll lead you to a lot of interesting places and reasons.
The money trail also leads right back to each individual, and we collectively, myself, we're guilty of always going for the best price, aren't we? So we don't always pay something higher that we know is produced more, better for the planet. We are always looking, comparing, going for generally lower prices as a collective society. And so when we cast blame on other people, we should really look at our own selves too, and we don't do that.
Yeah.
We're all guilty.
The dangers of the cheap cost of food, right?
Exactly.
How is something that cheap? And why? What are they doing that they're making it so cheap in terms of, you know, labor?
So we should take more of our funds and buy better produced food that's better for the climate than maybe spending it on other things. But we don't do that.
Okay, so in that question, like right here, people had answers to that like logical, obvious question. So when we started thinking about this multi-layer or multiple scenarios where we knew that we had to bring up the idea of regenerative agriculture and climate change, we realized there was an arena that we also had to be in. And this arena was the United Nations. You may like it, you may hate it, but it's there, and it's a body that is internationally built, acknowledged, and people follow a lot of the guidelines and decisions and programs and goals that are not so much implemented, but that are, how do you say, stated? Aired by the United Nations. Now, when you think about everything that has to do with climate change and land related to United Nations, there are three main bodies that deal with these issues, which, to start with, is absurd. Why does the United Nations have three different bodies that do not talk among each other? They don't communicate. They completely work in silos, which is, as part of a movement, you realize people have to stop working in silos. So why does United Nations do this? So you got the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. In other words, the COPs, right? So, you know, you got the COP21 in Paris, you had the COP22 in Morocco. So these are like the ones that are more known by people. This started back in 1994, was the first COP. And the most famous one was the Kyoto one in 1997, basically because most people wanted to sign on to that UN convention, but the United States did not, despite the fact that Al Gore was a huge part of the negotiation on that. I'm getting into US policy a lot, and we'll talk about that because you guys probably know way more than I do about it. We'll discuss more about it when I finish this presentation. We got the UNCCD, which is the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, and then we got the CBDs, which are the Conventions on Biodiversity. So 3 different bodies do not talk among each other, and I'm talking about things that obviously have to go together: desertification, climate change, and biodiversity. How come those guys are not talking? They're not creating something, you know, what in the world is wrong with them? What is happening? Again, they are not looking at the soil, they're not looking at issues of land use, even though there's scientific evidence that regenerative agriculture, or agriculture, the way we do it now, is a huge part of the problem. 50 or more. There's one organism, which is one body, that is the FAO. Anybody knows about FAO? Food and Agriculture Organization is also part of the UN Convention. And the FAO did something very interesting in terms of soil. You can look it up online. I didn't bring any slides or PowerPoint, I'm sorry, because I find them really boring, honestly. It's like you're looking at that and then you're like talking and it's right there. So I thought it would be better to just have a conversation. But if you want to look it up, we also have it at the website of Regeneration International, regenerationinternational.org, on the resources. But just do a Google search on FAO map of 2010 of human-induced soil degradation. Human-induced soil degradation, FAO 2010. Get that map online, right? And then get another map, which is, hang on, I want to get you the exact year. Oh, sorry, the first one is 2008. 2008 FAO Human-Induced Soil Degradation Map. Bring that up. Bring the 2010 World Hunger Map. And overlap them. You can even do, you know, with a papel de calcar, one of those transparent. And if you put them together, the areas where the soil has been degraded and disturbed for so many years by human beings do match the areas of the UN hunger map. So you're going to look that areas of the USA, Western Russia, parts of Europe, and South America are the areas that overlap the most. They're almost the same color. The way we're treating our soil and the way we're doing intensive agriculture is just insane. But if you look at the world hunger, right? Why isn't the United States, why is Europe, where are they getting their food from? Look at the production. It's very interesting to start overlapping all those maps, looking at soil degradation, looking at a world hunger, and how the traffic of food, the importing and exporting of food go around the world. It's very interesting to start matching all those different maps. And the FAO has actually been very good start talking about waste in agriculture and start taking a look at soil. So I would go for resources to the website of FAO, look at their maps, and start making also your own conclusions. We've been part, or as Regeneration International, we've been part of the conversations at the United Nations Climate Change Conference. So one of the 3 main bodies I was talking about earlier, for now probably 5 years. When we started going, there wasn't that much conversation about agriculture at all. Any of you have ever been to a COP, to one of these huge events? They happen every year. Ronnie, you have. I know you have. Okay, so the way these places run is kind of ridiculous. They're huge You get in there, there's like this sterile space, they're humongous, it's like they built a city solely for the purpose of that conference. They spend so much money, it's ridiculous. And you got a blue zone, which is the official zone. That's where government officials go, politicians go, ministers go for like a picture and to be there one day. And then you got the green zone, which is civil society organizations, companies that want to show the alternative for climate change and what their company is doing and sell a new technology. You got the country delegations that are there showing what they are doing to fight, not to reverse, but to fight climate change. And you got the whole way between the green zone, which is the civil society zone, and the blue zone, with everyone trying to lobby, trying to get a minister, trying to get someone to talk about how they can do something for their country, how they got a plan that will work and that will change. You also had those like almost like real-time experiences where you get these like glasses, these goggles, and you start looking at these 3D things. And they show you the world that will be in 5 years, right? So you see all these flats, and you see Paris, which, by the way, I don't know how the Seine is now, but it was rising a lot in the last week. You see Paris underwater, you see San Francisco underwater, you see LA underwater, you see New York. Well, you don't really have to see. We've all seen New Orleans underwater, haven't we? And so you see places that are completely flooded, you see all these drafts, you see all these climate change refugees and migrants moving from one place to the other. And so you're there looking at that and you realize, wait, this is already happening. Why are they showing me a 3D vision of what the world will look like if this is already taking place? In the blue zone, there's government delegations. I was lucky enough to be there at COP23 last year. I went, and basically what you gotta do is you go and you knock on the door of your government delegation and you're like, well, what's the official policy around these issues? What are you guys talking about? So we tried to approach them and lobby them with our magic regenerative agriculture proposals. Mexico had a delegation there. They had one talk, one event planned for the whole 2 weeks, where the Ministry of Agriculture was going to go and speak. We talked about several things when this presentation happened, brought up what's happening with corn, the fight against GMO corn in Mexico. We talked about the 4,000, which is an initiative that Mexico signed on as a country 2 years ago, and we'll discuss that as one of the outcomes of the UN 2015 meeting. They had no idea about any of those things. The US had, you guys retirees that withdrew from the UN climate change, the Paris Agreement last year, but it had a huge delegation. It was, they created this hashtag which was called "We Are Still Here," and they had an open bar. So everybody was there, and they were still there as well. But man, they were speakers, they had so much money invested in there. There was money from Mars, the one that makes M&M, Walmart, all these different folks proposing, other geoengineering, science fiction solutions and all that. But hey, you gotta still, you gotta give them, they were there and they were still there. So that's something. And then the French delegation was huge. The French delegation is becoming more and more important after the 2015 Paris Agreement. And how am I doing with time? Gregory?
Yeah, good.
Good? Okay. All right. I want to talk briefly about some of the things that happened during the 2015 Climate Change Conference. One of the things that I think was important was that people start realizing more and more that these conferences are kind of a waste of your time unless you create some agreements that are binding and mandatory. So it's not up to every country to plan their national goals and then, do whatever they can, because nobody's forcing them to do that. And it's important also to have a set of goals. So after 2015, one of the big outcomes of the Paris Paris Climate Agreement, was creating a set of sustainable development goals. Anybody familiar here with those? There are 17 goals. And I'm just gonna, read them really fast so I don't forget about any of these. But I want to propose this like little exercise, if you guys dynamic, where we're going to relate each of these sustainable development goals to soil and agriculture done in a regenerative way. So the first sustainable development goal is to end poverty, zero poverty. How can we relate that to soil?
Gardens.
Well,
Huh?
Land reform.
What's that?
Land reform. Land reform.
Land reform.
The lack of arable land in a lot of Africa and other places too is attributing to the poverty in those nations.
There you go. Okay. Okay. So if we have more agronomic or more agricultural production, if we improve the management of the soil, we understand that we could create a livelihood for farmers. Is that right? Okay. So we could relate it that way to soil. Yes.
Also, the kind of more individual farming, this goes against the grain of what everybody thinks, but as opposed to mass corporate agricultural farming, actually produces better outcomes, not only for the soil, but for the type of food that's produced, and the amount of it that's produced, and the diversity of what's produced.
Exactly.
So, and giving employment to more people. So all of that contributes tremendously to helping to end poverty. But it isn't just those things, obviously, because it's a whole different mindset of not chasing after the profit motive. So it does come back a lot of the times to that as well.
Land reform is what Sally
Land
said.
reform. Yeah. Yeah.
Are there examples of where this is happening, the small farms being developed or land reform actually working to change the quality of the soil and stuff?
Well, there's people that are doing regenerative agriculture projects in small parcels of land, and they are creating a livelihood and a means of life, not just for their family, but also for the surrounding community.
It's also not about just production, but it's distribution and consumption.
Right, that's true.
So farmers markets that are attached to these different experiments also have a certain importance that one can discuss.
Absolutely. Creating a market, yeah.
Less waste.
Can you address in this very topic the Cavendish banana, which crop is been a monolithic type of crop since 1841, and Africa has been growing by leaps and bounds and producing the banana. Because it's a particular breed and hasn't changed over the years, there is a fungus in the soil that's now destroying the crops. And what was once a very productive job, creating and food distribution network, is now going down the tubes, creating poverty because of people now losing their jobs and also food production.
Okay.
So one of the things that bothers me is the monolithic type of farming that we do, because it's become
Well, and that
Because
has,
it's going to come here and affect the banana production in Central America.
and that has to do with one of the, degenerative agricultural practices, which is not having any sort of crop rotation. I mean, you can't pretend that you can, grow the same thing, and that's going to create soil diversity. That's going to have an impact. That's going to have an effect on your soil no matter what. Yeah.
What bothers me is when a company like Monsanto controls the seed, and all of a sudden some unknown pest, some unknown fungus or bacteria destroys it. And then where is your food production?
Exactly.
So it ties directly into the poverty issue that you talked. How can you solve the issue of poverty when you have the issue of greed and corporate dominance of an agricultural industry?
Yeah. How do you change the whole system, right? Sir?
I think if we were to grow food for people instead of food for animals, it would do more to eliminate poverty than any other single thing we could do.
Well, yeah, and even, jobs, creation of jobs, and when we have mechanized farms, and I'm not saying I'm not anti-technology. I think technology is great. It's a great ally for farmers too. We work a lot with like drones, mapping ranches or mapping land. We work. I mean, you can't predict sometimes water patterns in ways that you weren't able to predict before. And there's a great addition for technology. But when everything becomes mechanized, you also have, instead of 10 people working on a piece of land, you have 1 or 0 people. So there's something to argue about that too. Okay, so end poverty, yes, sir, sorry.
I was thinking about your point that roughly 50% of agricultural activity contributes to climate change. Then I started thinking about biofuels. And so I'm thinking that biofuels are a real savior, but if the manufacturer of biofuels is contributing to climate change as well, that may be a problem, plus the fact that it's taking away food from consumers.
Yes, sir. No, that's a huge issue. You're right. You're right.
I just wanted to say that the World Health Organization ranks the healthiest countries in the world, and the United States is number 35.
35.
If we could promulgate that fact, that would, number one, solve some of our food problems, and then solve some of our medical problems. The United States is number 35. This is horrible.
Wow.
Totally
Wow.
unacceptable.
Number 35. Man. Yeah. Yeah. And we, sometimes they talk about organic food being more expensive, but man, it does save a lot of medical bills in the end, huh? Yeah.
Europe eats much better than the United States does, because they know what to do.
And they know what they have to ban too. So, I'm doing your job. I'm moderating. You're just sitting there.
You're only on number 1.
That's only number 1.
That's only number 1. We got 16 more to go.
16
Who's
more.
with me? All right. Number 2 is achieve food and nutritional security and advance sustainable agriculture. So food and nutritional security. We talk about ending poverty, number 1. Number 2, food and nutritional security. So what would be the role of soil and regenerative agriculture in that? I mean, pretty obvious to me, right? Do we have the type of food that Big Ag wants to convince us that it's better because we're going to be able to feed 9.5 billion people by 2050. Yeah, but the nutritional value of that asparagus, I'd rather not eat 10 asparagus if I can eat only 1 that is way better and has way more nutrients than 10 pieces of plastic that they're going to feed me, So that has to do also with soil management, the eco-efficiency of resources tags into that second sustainable development goal. The third one, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being. Healthy lives and promote well-being. Same thing here. Fourth, quality education, to provide quality education for people. Well, I don't know, that's kind of a far stretch to tie that with soil, but we could come up, yes. This is going to the UN after this, okay? We're already doing the job.
Well, I think what you have also is, you have a program in a lot of schools around the world, European, American, and others, where children are learning to grow food and to make their own food, and not, to a lot of people it's a mystery. You go to a supermarket and there's the food. Where'd it come from? What is it? So when children learn all of that by growing their own food and then preparing the food in the kitchens themselves, that fits into that goal of education, of trying to understand the whole importance of soil and agriculture to feeding people, and take away demystify, let's put it that way, where does our food come from? Because it just appears magically.
Yeah.
I think it's very important to educate how much does it take to produce a pound of beef. And it's equally important to realize how inhumane the animals are being treated. And equally important is to realize once we plant the Amazon forest that we deforested, planted 1 year, the second year the nutrients are gone, so basically you have wasteland. I mean, this is part of our education too. I think it's very important because it's important to eat right as well, eat humanely as well. If you are eating beef, know where the beef came from, and now know how the animal was treated. Like the gentleman said, there is a responsibility on each and every one of us to realize it's very important. If you want to save the planet, you have to be part of it. And we always think, oh, we can eat anything. No. We have to be fussy. We have to tell people. We have to confront big money. Because this is where it all boils, every question could boil to big money, big corporate interest. So much misinformation. It took so long for the organic industry to even produce and convince some people that the organic food is much better for you, much healthier. You are more with the planet instead of trying to dominate. And I think that is part of the education as well.
All right.
I think we could spend another hour talking about what we mean by quality education. For some people, it probably means vocational training. And yet, there's another question too. How important are the arts and literature to contribute to quality education?
All right. Okay. We're assessing the Sustainable Development Goals. We're getting there. Okay. Number 5, gender equality and women empowerment. Majority of small farmers in the world are women. Look at our state. Look at Guanajuato. Where are the men? They are all up north working. Who's actually, taking care of the land here? It's a women, right? So if we look at the soil as something that we have to take care of, and we need to create a viability, a way of life for all these people, well, we're definitely going to be supporting gender equality and women empowerment. Number 6, ensure availability and sustainable management of water.
That's another important subject.
Water. I mean, it's so obvious, the whole thing. I mean, the soil is a major reservoir of water. The soil that is not degraded, right? The ability that the soil has to capture water is amazing. If you just building up a little bit of soil organic matter multiplies the capability of the soil to absorb water. I mean, that's what soil always used to do, right? I mean, it would rain and it would stay there. Now it rains and just washes away.
Sustaining aquifers requires that they be seen as a common resource rather than as private property. So we need to avoid the privatization of groundwater by Coca-Cola or Nestle or other such corporate interests.
Look at what's happening in northern Mexico now, in Baja California, Mexicali, and other places with this, people from the community fighting against Modelo, the big, cerveceria, commercial beer company, trying to get all these aquifers. You know how much it takes to make, how much water it takes to make beer? It's a lot of water. Meanwhile, these people have no water to, not even drink, because another thing is we have no soil organic matter. The soil doesn't filter the water anymore, so whatever water gets into the aquifers, look at here, at Rio Laja, it's just water that you better don't touch it or you may become, something different. So it's like, doing that. How much money do they spend in huge cities in the world? Look it up. How much money does New York City spend to filter their water so they can make it potable water? Instead of that, they're realizing they gotta start working and talking to the farmers in upstate New York, the ones that are using the land, and make a sustainable use of the land. Don't put your pesticide, don't put your stuff, your shit in there, because that shit is getting into waterways, And instead of spending so much money in creating new plants to potabilize water, well, talk to the farmers around you. That's something we should be doing here in Guanajuato as well. If we treated the soil in a different way, that would also have a great impact on the quality of our water. Ensure access to modern energy. Access to modern energy. We may have, again, this is, interpretations. What is modern energy? What does that exactly mean? People start talking about biofuel, so a lot of people that link modern energy and soil management will make the obvious connection with biofuel as well. But also, the way we manage our soil, we can do it in a way that conserves the energy more or less. And we can start thinking about, how farms also can farm sun, solar panels, different ways that we can improve the way we're doing agriculture in general to save energy too. Promote sustainable economic growth.
What does that mean?
Promote sustainable economic growth. Again, words, right? Words are being so co-opted. Like we used to talk about sustainability, now it's a big word in the UN conferences, All you hear all the time is like sustainability, we need to scale up sustainably, and you're like, well, these are just empty concepts, empty words. Well, fill them with some substantial content as well.
But to talk about sustainable growth is a problem. Sustainability is one thing.
It's one thing.
Right.
But endless growth, can that be sustained?
Exactly. Exactly.
No way.
Right.
We need sustainable economies, but growing economies are part of the problem, not the solution.
And that's kind of an oxymoron. Yes, sustainable growth. How is that possible? I need to teach this guy a couple of things. Number 9, industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Okay. Number 10, I don't want you guys to fall asleep, so I'll go fast through this. Diminish inequality within and among countries.
Repeat that, please.
Diminish inequality within and among countries. Okay, that's a great development goal. That's a great sustainable development goal. Okay, so if we can increase the household income for a farm, is that going to change something? Yes, of course it's going to change something. Number 11, sustainable cities and communities. Okay, cities are also part of this whole thing. There's different ways also to make cities more regenerative, many ways. Number 12, responsible consumption and production. Again, consumption and production, that is responsible. What is it that is responsible? You know, that takes into consideration the planet, that takes into consideration all these different factors. Number 13, take urgent action to combat climate change. Okay, yes, urgent action, of course. We know we can sequester the CO2 that is right there in the atmosphere and put it back in the soil, and the soil has this capability to be a carbon sink. I mean, again, this is pure logic. How come these people at the UN are not talking about soil? They're not talking about agriculture. Number 14, life underwater. Protect life underwater. Also, you know, if the soil is just being completely degraded and we're losing cover soil going into the waterways, and we know that you know, there's pesticides and there's a lot of chemical fertilizers that are being running off to the waterways, well, we're killing a lot of the life under the water, killing coral reefs, yeah.
And antibiotics.
Antibiotics.
Into the water.
That too. Okay. It's not all bad. I know this sounds like, you know, doom and gloomy, but it's not. But it's not at all.
Number 17 is going to be positive, right?
Yes, number 17 is, now it's when it's going to change. Number 15, protect, restore, and promote terrestrial ecosystems. Okay?
Wow.
So, if you think about terrestrial ecosystems, well, the soils are the foundation for terrestrial ecosystems, aren't they? There they are. We just don't look at them. If we regenerate the soil, we protect our ecosystems. It's very simple. Number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. Go tell that to your president. Strong institutions. And peace and justice. 17, strengthen global partnerships. I mean, it's kind of positive, right? Strengthen global partnerships. Well, hey, the soil binds us all, you know? We're all made of that. Just like Adam, you know, is soil in Hebrew, and Eve too, right? They took the ribs and they made, right? So those are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I'm not saying they're perfect, they are perfectible. We can, you know, there's a lot of things that could be modified, but the important thing about having these instruments and why we look at the international scenario is that these things give us leverage, give us way to act in policy. You know, these guys, if Mexico, the Mexican government has signed in to the Paris Climate Agreement, they are to be held accountable by us, watchdogs, in one way or the other, about what they are doing. You guys committed to achieve all these different sustainable development goals. Well, what is happening? We're not going very well in that end here in Mexico, but it's election year, so you never know. So, I want to say that besides the Sustainable Development Goals, which was a great achievement from the Paris Climate Summit of 2015, there was something else that was really important that happened, which was something called the 4 per 1,000 initiative. 4P1000. It's a horrible name, but this is an initiative that was promoted by the French government, and the 4 per 1,000 is called Soils for Food Security and Climate Initiative. This is a global policy initiative which goal is to scale up regenerative agriculture as a means to achieve the goals outlined in the Paris Climate Accord of temperature, right? The good thing about the 4 per 1,000 is that it is an initiative that in a way connects all the 3 different bodies, all the 3 different conventions of the UN. So it looks at biodiversity, it looks at the certification, and it looks at climate change. The way they want to do it is they want to remove excess carbon from the atmosphere, put it down back in the soil by building up soil organic matter. What they say is like, okay, if every year we are able to build soil organic matter through a number of techniques that we're going to look into now, by 0.04% every single year, that's the 4,000, we're going to be able to remove the excess of carbon from the atmosphere and actually revert the trend. Because what we say is, okay, we don't need to just stop climate change. We don't need just to stop the climate and the weather from getting hotter. We actually need to revert the trend. So the methods that they're looking into, the 4,000, are simple things. Things that most farmers that do regenerative agriculture are already doing. Talking about cover crop, no tilling, so no disturbance of the soil. Think about every time we till, it's like we're like scratching our skin. The soil is the skin of the earth, and it's a layer that is pretty thin. So when you open it up, what you're doing is like that precious carbon that took the soil and all that village that is under the soil years and centuries to build, you're just letting it expose, you're just letting it oxidize with the contact with the air. So no tilling, no soil disturbance, cover crop, holistic grazing, so the way that many people are doing cattle now is no longer feedlots, is no longer CAFOs where the animals are all trapped in a small place, but more like management, so they go from one piece of land to the other, and the key is how long you keep your cows or your cattle in there. You just let them graze. Which, wasn't that what they used to do ages ago? No bare soil. I mean, again, if you leave your soil bare, it's just like going out in the San Miguel sun at 3 p.m. going like this, completely naked. That's kind of stupid. You know that you're going to get sunburned, right? And maybe you're going to get in jail. That also could happen. So the 4,000 is a great initiative because it's an initiative that is tangible, that is practical, that has already been signed on by over 60 countries now, over 60 countries, hundreds of international organizations, hundreds of producers, hundreds of research institutions, and what they have is the capability to start the conversation more and more about soil, agriculture, and climate change. And this is something that we want to promote. We want people and we want organizations to sign up to the 4,000 initiative. This is the most tangible outcome of the Paris 2015 summit. This is, again, just like the Sustainable Development Goals, tools that we need to use, leverage that we need to use. Mexico has signed up to the 4,000. We had a big event 2 years ago in April 2016 at the French Embassy with the SAGARPA, the Mexican USDA, who had to come because, hey, you guys signed, and what are you doing to implement these type of things? We had lots of regenerative agriculture practitioners from Mexico, from the States and other part of the world who are doing things in a good way. We know what needs to be done. You guys needs to be done. We know that it's urgent, and so we might as well start doing it, I think. So I could probably go on, but perhaps we should, open a little bit to discussion, because. Thank you.
Thank you, Ercilia. That's
Yes.
a lot of stuff to absorb.
Yeah.
I'm just going to take advantage of my situation to mention 3 things. One, you talked about people getting to know what the land looks like, the soil from the ground down. I have a terrible memory, but there is a film, a French film that was made about 10 years ago, in which they looked at a meadow in France over the period of a year, and they had little cameras in there. And you saw everything that was happening in the insect life coming up to the soil, the grass growing, and then the snow and so forth. If I can later remember that name and try. But it's a wonderful, delightful film and really gives you this soil's eye view of what's happening. Number two, if you've ever worked in inner cities and in a lot of rural areas, believe it or not, there's a concept that's called food deserts. And why are they called food deserts? Because you go there and there's, for poor people, nothing but crap to buy. If you maybe find an onion, you might find a wilted head of lettuce, and you can walk miles, and I know because I know this from the Bronx in New York, in a food desert I worked in. There's nothing but crap food. And very often when somebody mentioned here about buying more organic things and doing it, and we all have a responsibility, yes, but I have to put a but there. If you're a poor person, just to feed yourself or to get access to anything that by any stretch of the imagination is healthy is really difficult. So we have to talk about distribution and a fair price distribution, and that's what's really important. And that's starting to happen in cities with growing, I know in New York and Chicago, taking a lot of large buildings and actually growing things on them, which are for consumption. The third point, which I'll bring up, and then we'll open it up for more, which I just want to say, when large cities developed in Europe and the United States in the 19th century, what you had, which changed eons of the way agriculture was done and distributed, led to what is called, people have called a metabolic rift. What happened in earlier times throughout history is people tilled the land, you had animals doing there, and they had and people defecated. The animals defecated, and you use that as natural nutrients to help regenerate the soil. As a matter of fact, in Chinese agriculture, they have a name for human waste called night soil. And there were collectors who would come to take it and to use it in the fields. With the development of large cities, what happened to it? It went into sewers, and that was lost. So that return that you had, that organic, if you will, return of you consume something and you produce a waste, but a waste that is useful, is lost. And that's something we have to confront and get back to. So that's my spiel. Please, I'm sure you have a lot of questions for Ercilia, so go ahead.
Me?
Yes, sir.
Actually, this is before Cecilia, but one of our guests in the audience today commented on this. Is an overview of climate change. Approximately 8 years ago, I remember Mr. Ronnie Cummings set forth numbers, of which we were approximately 350, and just please don't take the absolute number, but we were at that point approaching and beyond the tipping point. And that was 8 years ago. I wonder what the overview of where we are in that regard to climate change right now.
What's the point we're at now? We're approaching 400.
So what does that say about the point that it was a tipping point of 350, if I remember a number, something like that?
Ronnie, is that what you said, 350?
Hey, I thought I could probably listen to a comment there.
Well, we reached 403 parts per million of CO2, and that's just a shorthand. We're talking about all the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But I think the general consensus now of climate scientists is that if we go past 450, we're done. And we're going to hit 450 at the rate we're going now. We're adding 2 parts per million per year. We're going to hit that in not very long from now, which is the reason why it's so important that all the countries of the world have agreed to go to zero fossil fuel emissions by 2050 or sooner. Looks now like we could hit, in terms of energy use, looks like we could hit zero emissions by 2030 if you just look at transportation, utilities, building construction, and so on. Why is that? Well, because now it's cheaper to invest in solar and wind than it is to build a new fossil fuel plant. So investors are not going to keep building fossil fuel plants because they can make more money otherwise. And we're rapidly approaching, within 5 years, where it's going to be cheaper to build new solar and wind than it is to operate our old coal plants and our old oil producing plants. So that part of it is going to go down. But the problem is, if we don't start sequestering more carbon into our soil and preserve our forests and marine ecosystems and wetlands, peatlands, at the same time, we are going to go past 450. And the thing is, if we go past 450, even if we get it quickly down to 350 and even 280 where it needs to be, we will have baked in several hundred years of really violent weather. And we will have melted the polar ice caps beyond the point where, yeah, we're going to be able to freeze them again in geologic time. So we're not going to be able to freeze them in time to save 1 billion people from having to move to higher ground. So we have to do both, but there is hope. That's the reason the 4 for 1,000 says, if we'll just sequester as much carbon as we're putting up and do it for 25 years, we will safeguard civilization's survival. If we don't, we may not. And so this is not the task for the future generation. This is us. I got 20 years left. Looking around the room, most of you've got 20 years left too. This is the decisive point. We and our children and our grandchildren have got to join with the people of, well, we can do this. So let's not think it's not possible. The extra carbon in the atmosphere used to be in the ground as recently as 1750. We can put it there again. And we can do it quickly because we've got farmers. I mean, one thing about San Miguel, just to give you a little optimism, is we got, what, 140,000 people in San Miguel. There's about 4,000 people regularly buying organic food now. Not just occasionally, regularly. Okay? And we also have, even at Be Organica store, we have 248 small producers from the area who are farming organically, whether they're certified or not. And in terms of beef, you said we can't feed animals, the grain. We can't feed herbivores anymore grain. The biggest beef producer in this area is called Cañada de la Virgen. Her farm is out near the pyramid. She's got 800 head of cattle on 10,000 acres of land, and she's doing it right. And a lot of stores and restaurants are now serving that. So there's a potential. There's really a potential to turn things around and to start to turn things around in the next few years. While we go to 100% renewable energy, we've got to go to 100% regenerative food and farming and land.
And one of the dangers you touched on, which I'd just like to expand on if I may, is the acidification of the oceans. And when we're dumping all this stuff into it and everything else that we mentioned earlier in Ercilia's talk, what you're doing is not just changing what's in the oceans, but you're changing the way the currents go in the ocean, which then affects the weather, which then affects what are arable areas. We come back to the soil, because it all, as you said, is connected. So if the weather is changing, if the monsoons change in South Asia, if you have more vicious hurricanes here which destroy and rip up the land and rip up trees, just imagine it's a domino kind of effect. And what does it happen? You also, you use the ocean as a source of food as well, of course, marine life, we eat. So all of this is something that has to be taken into account, and we see. And if we don't get it down, as Ronnie just said, that acidification is going to proceed apace. It's going to change the Gulf Stream and the southern streams of the southern Atlantic and so forth, which is going to change so much. So enough of that. Yes, sir.
Talking about night soil, when the Chinese used night soil 500 years ago, it was organic. What you receive now in sewage treatment is far from organic. It has all kinds of chemicals and bacteria and things that would not be good to put back on land. And they're not treated as pumped in the ocean.
Right.
The bacteria is treated out of them, but all the chemical stuff in it are not.
Well,
and to use that to put on the land would be a very important thing, I would think, for land.
yeah. Well, it has to be filtered. I mean, you have things like birth control pills, antibiotics, we mentioned, and so forth, which, like with the water, has to be filtered out as well. But that doesn't mean you can't use it, but it does require filtration, as it does require water. Who hasn't spoken yet? This gentleman here, we'll come to Sally. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah. I read that in 2017, solar farms were cheaper than coal farms for producing electricity. India abandoned its coal farm in favor of solar plant. Burlington, Vermont is already 100% fossil fuel free. The state of Maryland and the state of California are working on that by the year 2040. Britain will ban internal combustion engines by 2040. I think there's a move that's happening, and it's going to happen more quickly than you think.
Well, yeah, yes, and of course tell that to Trump. But the things that you take a look at Germany as an example, which doesn't have a lot of sunlight, certainly compared to Mexico, and they're using alternative energy. They'll probably, within the next 2025, I think all of their energy is going to be produced by solar, geothermal, or wind, and no coal. And of course, Germany was a major coal producer, especially the eastern part of the country, Thuringia, Saxony, and so forth.
But they're starting to shut down their coal plants.
They're shutting down coal plants, but amazingly, that a place that has so little sunlight. And just think about us here in Mexico, the positive, we could supply energy, or the southern part of the United States. I mean, all of it, because Germany can do it. But with just solar, the potential is tremendous. Sally, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, a couple of things. I first got interested in the problem of food production about 100 years ago when I was a student at San Francisco State College, and I learned that there were Mexicans who were coming out and working as, they were in the farms, working in the farms, and suffering greatly from poverty and exploitation. But what was important at that time, which hasn't been mentioned here at all, there's two things. One was land reform, which was really important because the farmers owned their land. They had control over their land. That has been taken away a lot by the big corporations who are doing agribusiness, so that's a new thing. And the other thing that was really important was sustainability, self-sufficiency. And that hasn't been mentioned. And so what's happened to that? So I'm thinking also that the U.S., for example, has 5% of the world's population, and it uses 25% of the world's food. So it's, you know, the poor countries actually are feeding America. So anyway, that has to be changed. But the other thing that is in my head is there's a big elephant in the room. And that is, to me, to make the changes that are really needed, you're going to have a revolution. Because all of these things are, like I said, they're all connected. But they're only going to happen if the people rise up and demand it, organize and demand, in my estimation.
Yeah, well, I agree. We need to have a revolution. That's for sure. And we need to have it soon. So we need to stand up. I agree. We need to have a revolution. In terms of land reform, you know, what has been happening all over the world is just land grabbing and big corporations, you know, getting land from people. We see it even here, even like in a country like Mexico that had an amazing agricultural revolution and a modern constitution 101 years ago, and we've seen that with, you know, international treaties like NAFTA, they've done to those pieces of land. So no, it's no longer communal land. This is what's happening in Mexico. This is what's happening in places like in South America, where we lost a generation of farmers because now it's all in the hands of big landowners and big corporations. So yes, we need to take over that corporate takeover and yeah, and change the way things are being done. And in terms of immigration, it's very interesting what you mentioned, Sally. We are working right now, one of the projects that we're working on with Regeneration International is we're looking at immigration, not just as, you know, climate change refugees, but we're looking at the issue of immigration and the issue of lack of work in many places, especially in Central America and in Mexico where we work. And we had a migrant summit in October last year in Guatemala, where the idea was, how do you create community, regenerative, ecological projects that are sustainable but are also regenerative in terms of, you know, putting that carbon back in the soil, and that bring livelihood. So if we look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, man, we're tapping all 17 of those. So how do we look at, you know, the issue of remittances, which we've talked about several times in talks at the Center for Global Justice too. When people send their money from the States, families send their money from the States to Central America or Mexico, you have to pay 5% to Western Union or 7% once you submit the money. And when people go and collect the money in their home countries, they have to pay also 3 to 4%. So it's an enormous amount of money that is being kept by Western Union, by Electra, by Banco Azteca, whichever the institution is that is in charge of sending their money back and forth. So the idea is, how do we push those big corporations? And there's been many projects doing this in Mexico. We just need to put them together. How do we push these corporations so that they deduct first the amount of interest that they take from when people send remittances, but also that, you know, using their guilt and their social responsibility, they put some money towards regenerative projects, you know, and then they put money. Then the people at the clubs, the Latino clubs in the States or wherever it is, or in Canada, they also put some money towards the communities where they come from. And the municipality does the same. For instance, in Guanajuato, lots of people, Guanajuato is one of the largest countries that expels population to the States. Lots of people from Guanajuato area go to Dallas-Fort Worth, right? So how can you get all these, you know, chambers of commerce from Latinos, Latino groups in Dallas-Fort Worth, to contribute for regenerative projects? It could be, you know, poultry project, it could be a farm, it could be a milpa regenerative project, which the milpa by itself is per se a very regenerative type of crop. So how can you get them and get the municipality of Guanajuato to put money towards something like this? We need to look at immigration, and we need to look at that as a way to be able for people, you know, to stay in the farmland too. Who's going to cultivate that farmland otherwise? We're getting so many retornados and deportados now, even in Mexico City. You know, there's like thousands of deportados that are being brought to that area. Some of them are younger and they don't really know how to farm. Some of them are, you know, over 40 and their experience is in farming. Mexico City is huge, but there's so much farming happening there that we're already talking to groups that are part of Regeneration International that do work in the Chinampas in southern Mexico City, in Xochimilco, about, you know, giving all these people that are coming back a source of living and doing that via regenerative agriculture. But yes, we need the revolution, sorry. Yeah.
You know, I want to come back to the second goal, nutritional security. Seems to me that one of the things that is crucial for that is that countries avoid the kinds of trade agreements that we see with NAFTA here. Because before that, Mexico was largely nutritionally sustainable, produced the food for its people and distributed it. But now, much of what is produced is exported to El Norte. And Mexico ends up having to import much of its food. And much of what comes in is not healthy, good quality food, as was pointed out. You know, so the whole notion that a country can develop by orienting its economy toward export and import, I think is a dead end. That it needs to focus on internal development and make that sustainable in terms of food and other necessities as well. You know, and that brings me to my question. What do you think would happen here if Trump did pull out of NAFTA and the whole agreement collapsed?
I think it would be a blessing for Mexico. I think we need that to happen. Even as, you know, the whole thread about the wall was a little kick in the ass for, you know, Mexicans to react a little bit, I think that would be fantastic. I mean, Mexico is importing corn. We're importing corn. There was this test on tortillas, corn tortillas in Mexico. Over 89% of those tortillas have GMO corn. A country that has a ban on GMO corn planting, and a country that is made out of corn, and this is their staple food from the moment, you know, they get up with their atole and their tamales to the moment they go to bed before dinner and eat their tortillas. So I think that, Mexico is the 5th most diverse country in the world. We're number 5. There's so much. I mean, granted, if you look at, you know, the northern part of Mexico, this is one of the places where arable land is completely degraded. But there's great initiatives there. There's a couple of savory hubs in Chihuahua and other parts of northern Mexico. And what these guys do is they do a lot of rotational grazing, you know. So they are looking in the past, you know, 10 years that they've been working. They measure the carbon content in soil, but they also measure the capability of restoration of the land. And they are doing a phenomenal work at bringing the land to where it was with cattle decades ago. So can Mexico be self-sufficient in terms of food? Absolutely. Absolutely it can. Now, we got other evils in Mexico because, you know, Bimbo is Mexican. You were talking about the inner city. Well, you go to any tiendita in rural, you know, I'm staying out at a ranch by Jalpa. If you go to Jalpa, on the way to Querétaro, there's, you know, a few people, it's a small town. What do they have? They have Bimbo food, Coca-Cola, they got the tiendita, and that's what they offer. Doritos, exacto, Bimboyos, and you're like in the middle of farmland where you can actually grow healthy food. So it will take a village, it will take a revolution and a whole change of, you know, attitude, get more educated, all of us as producers and as consumers, but maybe that will force, you know, Trump withdrawing from NAFTA, that will force Mexico to do it. Yeah, I hope. I hope it happens too.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to just see if we can bring the conversation back to the animal agriculture situation again, because I think that's really a big elephant in the room when you talk about agriculture and climate change, as far as all the evidence that I have seen and read. And clearly a lot of that is due to the impact of the industrial animal agriculture. But I think it's you know, irresponsible to promote holistic grazing and cross has been debunked by most responsible scientists and writers like George Monbiot and others as, not, something that really works. I see some isolated utility for holistic grazing, for its ecological impacts, but not continuing to perpetuate to raise animals for food, which sends, if we want to create a food system for the elite, we've already got enough elite problems going on. If we want to create a system where, a handful of people in the 1% can eat grass-fed beef, then fine. But I think what we really need to do is figure out a way to drastically reduce or eliminate our dependence on animal products for food.
Yes.
Veganism for all.
Well, this is a very, very contentious subject.
Yeah.
I was a vegetarian for 40 years, so I have some experience. I was a leader in the vegetarian movement in the United States, the campaigns against McDonald's and the Beyond Meat campaign. But I've learned some things since then that I think are important to keep in mind. One is that there's 70 billion farm animals in the world. 70 billion. Okay? 2/3 of them are in confinement. 2/3. All right? What the regeneration movement is saying is those, 40 billion animals in confinement, you should not consume those products. Period. 0 is the amount of meat and animal products you should consume from CAFOs or factory farms. 0 for your health, for the health of the climate, with humane, ethical consideration for the animals, for the fact that this puts small herds people and farmers out of business. 0. Okay? On top of that, any natural health physician or practitioner would tell you that the average American consumption of 222 pounds of meat a year is a recipe for health disaster. They will all tell you you need to reduce your income or your intake if you want to optimize your health, live longer and live well, by at least 2/3 the average consumption of Americans. So I don't think there's any disagreement about that. But what is more difficult for people to grasp, including Monbiot and some of these people who write about it, is that there have always been a tremendous number of animals and mammals on the ground. The question is, are these mammals overgrazing or undergrazing, and so on and so forth? It's like if we don't get more mammals, for example, in the tundra areas of the earth, and the Russian steppes, and so on, like they used to have, we really don't even have a possibility of reversing climate change. So, if people consumed the proper amount of herbivore meat and animal products, we could have a better climate, okay? But we can't, look at Pollo Feliz. That's the most popular place in San Miguel. Look on every side of town, by Choco, look at where this beef is coming in from. We have to stop the factory farm disaster from going forward. So my plea is to vegans and vegetarians to sit down and talk with regenitarians or whatever, and come to where we can agree right now, and then look at what we could do. Because we literally cannot reverse climate change without billions of animals on the land, properly managed, properly grazing. We are not going to get enough carbon. There's twice as much pasture land and range land in the world as there is cultivated farmland. Okay? There's 4 billion acres of cultivated farmland. There's 8 billion acres of rangeland and farmland which are not suited, like the Amazon that was mentioned, for growing crops. Okay? And there's 10 billion acres of forests. It's like the amount of carbon sequestration evidence that we have right now on the pasture land is 5 times greater than on proper cultivation of crops. In other words, it's a factor of 10 to 1. So that's why I would urge us all to dig deeper. Look at the regeneration.org website and hear the other side of the story